So, imagine you're walking down the street, right?
Mm.
And you look at a house.
Okay, a house.
Yeah. And from the outside, it looks great. The paint is completely fresh. The roof looks totally solid. It's, sitting pretty on a really nice lot. It just looks like a perfectly functional, even really valuable piece of property.
Sure.
But uh, behind the drywall, right, like beneath the floorboards, termites have just been quietly eating the load-bearing beams for, I don't know, 5 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And there are no outward signs of distress at all. You literally don't know there's a problem until the exact moment the second floor just suddenly collapses right into the living room.
Which is, I mean, a terrifying realization if you happen to actually be standing in that living room when it happens. It's the illusion of structural integrity.
Exactly. And when you step into the world of corporate strategy, of organizational survival and decline, you realize that so many massive, globally recognized companies are exactly like that house.
Oh, completely.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky. Like a broken business strategy might still look like it's functioning perfectly.
Yeah.
It might even be throwing off record quarterly profits right up until the moment the whole company essentially implodes.
Right, because the rot in a corporate structure, what researchers actually call strategic decay, is often entirely invisible to the people who are supposedly, in charge of monitoring the foundation.
Yeah, that invisible rot. And more importantly, how to actually build a structure that survives the elements. That is the entire focus of what we're doing today on this deep dive.
And we have a lot to cover.
We really do. We are pulling apart this massive, highly academic compendium. It's called the Oxford Handbook of Strategy, a strategy overview and competitive strategy. It's edited by David O. Faulkner and Andrew Campbell. And I want to be really clear about what this source is for you listening, because it's not a breezy airport business book.
No, definitely not.
It doesn't have a catchy title or like 10 easy steps to becoming a millionaire.
Mm-hmm. Far from it. I mean, it's a true heavyweight text. Mm-hmm. The editors specifically designed this compendium to sit right in that sweet spot between highly theoretical specialist journals and your established foundational textbooks.
Right.
So it is explicitly targeted at advanced academics, researchers, and senior executives, the people who actually have to wrestle with these incredibly complex problems in the real world. Because out there, a wrong decision doesn't just mean a bad grade on a paper.
No.
It means, 10,000 people lose their jobs.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission here is to extract the absolute best, most counterintuitive insights and practical frameworks from this massive text. We're going to take you on a journey from the foundational theories of why a firm even bothers to exist in a free market, all the way through the sort of hand-to-hand combat of local competitive strategy.
And then into macro stuff, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The immense complexities of international corporate networks, and finally, how to medically diagnose and turn around a dying corporation before, the floorboards collapse.
It's a really comprehensive arc. And to really grasp how we currently think about business strategy, you kind of have to understand the historical vacuum that it emerged from.
Oh, for sure.
Because if you go back a century, or honestly even just 70 years, business leaders didn't have a dedicated field of strategy to draw from. If they wanted any theoretical guidance, they had to look to classical economics.
Which fundamentally could not solve real-world business problems.
Yeah.
I mean, the text makes a really compelling point right out of the gate about this break from economics. Chapter 2, which is authored by John Kay, Peter McKiernan, and David Faulkner, they essentially argue that Econ 101 is practically useless for a CEO who's just trying to outmaneuver a rival.
Yeah, think about the baseline assumptions of neoclassical economics. You have this concept of homo economicus, right?
A perfectly rational human.
Exactly, this perfectly rational, perfectly calculating theoretical entity. This person never makes a decision out of spite or ego or, just fatigue. The theory assumes that decision makers are constantly, tirelessly maximizing profit, and crucially, that they have access to perfect, symmetrical information.
Right. The idea that when you sit down to negotiate a deal, you supposedly know exactly what the other side's costs are, what their alternatives are, and what the future market conditions are going to be.
It's wild.
It's totally wild. And based on those wildly unrealistic assumptions, the mathematical models predict that markets will always naturally just sort of glide toward a state of perfect equilibrium.
And in that theoretical equilibrium, supernormal profits, meaning making significantly more money than your competitors over a long period, are deemed virtually impossible.
Because why?
Because the moment you start making excess profit, the theory dictates that new competitors are going to immediately spot it. They're going to enter your market with zero friction, and they'll just drive prices down until those massive profits totally evaporate.
Look, if you've spent more than like 5 minutes in an actual corporate office or tried to launch a startup, you know that is a complete fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
The real world is incredibly messy. People are wildly irrational. Information is hidden, it's hoarded, or it's just completely misunderstood. And markets can stay unbalanced and chaotic for decades.
Yeah, and that frustration with the sterility of economics is exactly what births strategic management as a distinct discipline. Economics basically views the firm as a black box, right? Capital and labor go in, products and market clearing prices come out.
Right.
It assumes one unit of management is entirely interchangeable with another. The whole concept of a visionary entrepreneur or an idiosyncratic management style like a Steve Jobs or a Jack Welch, they simply do not fit into modern economic equilibrium theory. So strategy as a discipline was created to, open that black box and figure out what is actually happening inside.
Yeah. And to illustrate how strategy actually evolved to deal with that messiness, the text focuses heavily on General Electric. They use GE as this incredible microcosm. It's a single company that basically reflects 4 decades of strategic evolution.
GE is the perfect lens for this just because of its sheer scale and its longevity.
So you look at the origins with Thomas Edison. It's pure, raw entrepreneurship. It's a guy in a lab commercializing electricity. There was no formal strategy department. The strategy is just the sheer force of Edison's inventive genius.
Right.
But as the century progresses, the company grows into an absolute behemoth. So by the 1960s, the text points out that GE became the ultimate poster child for formal corporate planning.
Oh, yeah. This was the era of the rational approach. You kind of have to picture entire floors of corporate headquarters just filled with analysts and planners churning out these massive multi-volume binder.
The binder era.
The binder era, exactly. They truly believed that if they just gathered enough data, they could rationally, sort of deterministically plot out the future of every single business unit, like 5 or 10 years in advance.
Which sounds exhausting and honestly a bit arrogant. The idea that you can perfectly predict a global market 10 years out.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the world got more turbulent. The oil shocks happened, inflation spiked, global competition from Japan arrived, and those 5-year binders became instantly obsolete. Which brings us to the late 1980s shift. The text notes how GE shifted aggressively away from massive centralized corporate planning and moved toward an intense, almost ruthless focus on the core business.
Right. The era associated with Jack Welch, though the book focuses primarily on the organizational shift itself. The philosophy basically changed from, we can plan for everything to we need the agility to react to anything.
Right.
The emphasis moved to stripping away bureaucracy, shedding businesses where they couldn't be the absolute number 1 or number 2 player in the market, and really decentralizing decision-making.
It really shows that strategy isn't a static formula you just memorize. It is an evolving toolkit that changes based on how chaotic the external environment is. But this brings up a fundamental question. We're talking about GE, this massive corporation with hundreds of thousands of employees. Martin Slater actually tackles this in Chapter 3.
Oh, this is a great chapter.
If classical economics is all about the efficiency of free markets and independent actors, why do companies even exist in the first place?
It's one of those foundational questions that sounds almost childish until you genuinely try to answer it. Like, why isn't everyone just an independent contractor?
Right. If the free market is the ultimate, most efficient pricing mechanism for everything, why do we build these massive bureaucratic hierarchies called firms? Why doesn't an entrepreneur just wake up, contract a freelance designer for a product, contract a freelance factory in China to build it for a day, contract a freelance marketing guy to sell it, and then just dissolve the whole operation by dinner time?
Exactly. Why build a boundary? Why hire full-time employees?
Yeah.
Well, the answer lies in the groundbreaking work of Ronald Coase and the theory of transaction costs. Coase looked at the theoretical frictionless market and said, wait a minute. Using the market actually costs money.
Okay, explain the friction, because if I go to the store and buy a gallon of milk, that feels pretty frictionless to me.
Well, buying milk is a simple, standardized transaction. But imagine you were trying to build a complex software system or, a jet engine, purely through the open market. There are massive search costs just to find a supplier capable of doing the work.
Right.
Then there are negotiation costs. You're haggling over the price, the terms. Then you have to hire lawyers to write an incredibly complex, airtight contract to ensure they deliver exactly what they promise.
Multiple lawyers.
Right. And finally, you have enforcement costs. Because if the supplier cuts corners or uses substandard materials, you have to take them to court, which takes years and millions of dollars. Okay, I see it. If you have to endure that entire agonizing process for every single tiny component, every single piece of code, every marketing brochure, the friction becomes absolutely overwhelming. You'd spend like 99% of your time negotiating contracts and 1% of your time actually building the product.
Precisely. Coase realized that a firm exists and draws a literal boundary around itself at the exact point where it becomes cheaper and more efficient to organize those transactions internally through a management hierarchy and salaried employees than it is to constantly go out and brave the open market.
Right.
You bring the marketing guy in-house and pay him a salary so you don't have to renegotiate a contract every time you need an email drafted.
So a company is essentially an island of a planned, centralized economy just floating in a massive ocean of free markets. And the shoreline of that island, the boundary of what the firm does internally versus what it outsources, is drawn exactly where the transaction costs of doing it yourself equal the costs of buying it outside. That is the essence of the theory of the firm. But, establishing that boundary is only the first step. The more difficult question is how that firm survives over time in a constantly changing environment. And this is where Chapter 4 by David Barron introduces the evolutionary theory of the firm. And frankly, it introduces a deeply unsettling concept for management.
Let me set up an analogy here because I think business leaders deeply misunderstand how evolution actually works in the corporate world. When executives talk about a company surviving a market disruption, they usually describe it using Lamarckian evolution.
Right. Lamarck, the biologist who predated Darwin.
Exactly, the giraffe guy. So Lamarck's theory was that giraffes got long necks because an individual giraffe stretched and stretched to reach higher leaves. Over its lifetime, its neck got physically longer from the effort, and then it passed that newly stretched neck down to its offspring. It's a theory of deliberate, conscious adaptation.
Which is exactly how we view corporate strategy. A visionary CEO sees the market changing, consciously stretches the company's capabilities, reshapes the culture, pivots the product line, and boom, the company survives.
Exactly. We idolize the CEO as this heroic adapter. But Darwinian evolution doesn't work that way at all. Darwin realized that the environment just throws up challenges, say a forest where all the short trees die out. The giraffes don't consciously stretch. They're just born with random neck lengths.
Right.
The short-necked ones simply starve and die. The environment blindly selects the winners based on who happened to have the right traits at the right time.
Yeah.
So my question for you, looking at the text's analysis of population ecology by thinkers like Hannon and Freeman, is this. Is a company's survival really based on its own brilliant conscious adaptations? Or is the market just a harsh, unforgiving environment that naturally kills off the weak firms, regardless of how hard the CEO tries to pivot?
Hannon and Freeman's population ecology leans heavily into the Darwinian side. And honestly, it is a bitter pill for executives to swallow. Their research suggests that large established organizations suffer from massive structural inertia.
Meaning they are incredibly resistant to fundamental change.
Yes, completely. They have entrenched cultures, massive sunk costs and legacy equipment, labyrinthine political factions fighting over budgets, and established routines that are almost impossible to unlearn.
Right.
So when the environment shifts radically, let's say the shift from analog film to digital photography, it is exceedingly rare for the incumbent giants to successfully adapt.
So the CEO's desperate attempts to pivot are often just useless.
Often, yes. Population ecology argues that market progress isn't driven by the old firms learning new tricks. It is driven by the old firms dying out and being completely replaced by a new population of firms. Startups that were naturally born with the right genetic makeup for the new digital environment from day one. They didn't have to adapt. They were perfectly suited to the new reality by default. The text points out that this evolutionary perspective is a massive force in determining market development. It often completely dwarfs the more newsworthy role of supposedly great industrial leaders trying to, steer the Titanic away from the iceberg.
That is deeply humbling. I mean, it implies that if you are running a legacy company during a paradigm shift, you might just be a short-necked giraffe in a forest that suddenly only grows tall trees. And no amount of strategic planning is going to save you from starvation.
It is a dark view, for sure. But the text doesn't leave us entirely helpless. The environment is harsh, yes, but firms do have tools to fight back, particularly when it comes to technology and innovation.
Right.
Which brings us to David Teese's framework in Chapter 6. If there is one practical, absolute must-understand concept in the first part of this book, it is Teese's work on the strategic management of technology.
Because he completely dismantles the greatest myth in business. Build a better mousetrap, and the world will beat a path to your door.
It is a beautiful sentiment, and it is historically demonstrably false. Teese argues that having a superior technology or being the first to invent something brilliant is absolutely not enough to guarantee you will actually capture the profits from that invention.
Right.
Business history is just a graveyard of brilliant engineers and inventors who died broke, while massive corporations commercialized their ideas and reaped billions.
Okay, so how do you actually profit from an innovation? How do you make sure you aren't just doing the R&D for a larger competitor to steal? Because the text lays out Teese's 3 rigorous requirements. Let's walk through them.
Sure. So the first requirement is what Teese calls a strong appropriation regime.
Meaning your ability to build a legal fortress around your idea.
Precisely. Are your patents completely ironclad, or are they easily circumvented by a clever lawyer? Is the underlying knowledge easily protected as a trade secret, like, say, the Coca-Cola formula? Or is it something a competitor can easily reverse engineer the moment they buy one off the shelf?
Oh, yeah.
If your appropriation regime is weak, the moment you launch your brilliant new product, a well-funded competitor will just copy the mechanics, slap their own logo on it, and crush you with their larger marketing budget.
Okay, let's say you have an army of patent lawyers, and your appropriation regime is totally solid. What's the second hurdle?
The second is getting your specific product adopted as the dominant design paradigm in its market niche.
I always think of the classic tech wars here.
Yeah.
You know, VHS versus Betamax.
Yeah.
Or why the QWERTY keyboard is still standard even though it was originally designed to slow down mechanical typewriters so the keys wouldn't jam. The dominant design doesn't even have to be the technically superior product, does it?
It rarely is. I mean, in the early days of any new industry, say early automobiles or early personal computers, there is a period of massive flux. Everyone is trying weird configurations, 3 wheels, steering tillers instead of wheels, steam power instead of gas. But eventually, the market settles on a dominant design. 4 wheels, a steering wheel, an internal combustion engine. Once that dominant design is established, the basis of competition completely shifts. It's no longer about radical new features. It becomes a brutal game of price, scale, and incremental improvements.
So if you're outside that design.
Exactly. If your patented innovation is outside of that dominant design, say you hold the greatest patent in the world for a steam-powered car engine after the market has already settled on gasoline, you just become a historical footnote.
Okay, so you have the patent, and you've somehow managed to make your invention the standard that everyone else has to build around. You're safe.
Right.
You're printing money.
Not unless you secure the third requirement, which is arguably the most difficult. You need sufficiently strong complementary assets.
This is the mechanism that I think blindsides so many tech startups. They think the code or the molecule is the entire business.
It is a fatal misunderstanding of value creation. The innovation itself, the core technology, is really only a tiny fraction of what it takes to actually deliver a product to a consumer and extract cash.
Yeah.
To get it to market, you need complementary assets. You need massive manufacturing capabilities to produce the item reliably at scale and at the lowest possible cost. You need an established, trusted distribution network to actually get it onto store shelves globally. You need an after-sales service network to handle repairs. You need a trusted brand name so consumers will even take a chance on it.
I want to ground this in a real-world scenario. Let's say I'm a brilliant biochemist. And working alone in my small lab, I discover a miraculous new pharmaceutical compound that cures a major disease. And I patent it. It is undeniable.
Okay, so you hold the intellectual property.
Right. But I am just one person. I don't own a sterile, FDA-approved manufacturing facility capable of producing millions of doses a month. I don't have $1 billion to fund 10 years of grueling phase 3 clinical trials. And I certainly don't have a global sales force of 10,000 reps ready to fly out and educate doctors in 80 different countries.
You completely lack the complementary assets. So what happens next?
Well, I assume I watch a massive pharmaceutical giant like a Pfizer or Novartis step in.
Exactly. Because they control the complementary assets, they hold all the leverage. They might offer to license your miraculous compound, but they will offer you pennies on the dollar for its true value. Why? because they know you have no alternative route to market.
Wow.
Or worse, if your appropriation regime, your patent, has even a tiny loophole, they will use their massive R&D budget to invent a slightly altered molecule that achieves the exact same result, bypassing your patent entirely. Then they utilize their manufacturing and sales networks to capture 100% of the profits.
That's rough.
TISA's ultimate point is that a strong technology strategy without complementary assets is a recipe for weak profit performance. The innovators invent, but the owners of the complementary assets get rich.
That is a brutal, clear-eyed view of how capitalism actually functions, and it perfectly transitions us from the theoretical boundaries of the firm into the actual arena.
Right.
You exist, you survive the evolutionary culling, you manage to lock down your patents and build your assets. Now, how do you actually fight the guy across the street? This brings us to part 2 of the text, competitive strategy.
This is where strategy moves from the existential to the tactical. How do you win market share on a Tuesday? And Chapter 10 by John McGee starts by breaking down a very common misconception about how industries are structured. He introduces the concept of strategic groups.
I'm totally guilty of this misconception. When I look at a massive sector, let's say the airline industry or the automotive industry, I tend to treat it as a giant monolith. I ask questions like, what is the ultimate best strategy for an airline to be profitable?
And McGee argues that the question itself is flawed. There is no single best strategy for an entire industry. Within any given industry, firms do not all compete against each other equally. Instead, they cluster together based on the similarity of their strategic choices. These clusters are called strategic groups.
Let's stick with the airline industry to map this out, because the differences are really stark.
Very stark. So on one hand, you have the legacy carriers, the Deltas, the Uniteds, the British Airways. Their strategy is incredibly complex. They operate massive hub-and-spoke networks. They fly globally. They offer first-class cabins, airport lounges, and complex loyalty programs.
Right.
They're competing on premium service, global reach, and corporate contracts. That is one strategic group.
And then, existing in the exact same broader industry, flying the exact same routes sometimes, you have the ultra-low-cost carriers, the Spirits, the Ryanairs. Their strategy is entirely different. They fly point-to-point, often to secondary airports. They offer zero amenities. They charge you for carry-on bags and a cup of water. They compete purely, ruthlessly, on having the absolute lowest ticket price. That is a totally different strategic group.
And here's the crucial point McGee makes. Both of these strategic groups can be highly profitable using completely contradictory strategies. The discount carrier isn't a failed premium carrier. It is just succeeding at a different game.
But if they're both profitable, what keeps the group stable? I mean, if the economy booms and people want premium seats, why doesn't Spirit Airlines just upgrade its planes and start acting like Delta for a few years and then switch back when a recession hits?
Because of what McGee calls mobility barriers. Classical economics focuses on barriers to entry, like the sheer cost of buying planes to start an airline from scratch. Mobility barriers are like barriers to entry, but they exist inside the industry. They prevent firms from moving between strategic groups.
So Spirit can't just become Delta overnight.
It's virtually impossible. To cross that mobility barrier, Spirit would have to completely restructure its entire business model. It would have to buy a totally different fleet of aircraft that can fly long haul across oceans. It would have to negotiate entirely new union contracts for flight attendants and pilots. It would have to spend billions building out physical airport lounges.
And the brand, too.
Exactly. Perhaps most dauntingly, it would have to overcome its own established brand reputation. Business travelers who expect luxury are not going to suddenly start booking first-class tickets on Spirit just because they bought nicer seats. Those mobility barriers are the defensive walls that protect the profitability of the firms within a specific strategic group from being easily attacked by firms in other groups.
Okay, so that framework, looking at the industry, defining the groups, assessing the mobility barriers, is very externally focused. You're looking outward at the terrain. And the text notes that for a long time, thanks largely to the towering influence of Michael Porter, this external structural view completely dominated strategic thinking. Find an attractive industry, build barriers, defend your position.
Right.
But chapters 12 and 13, authored by Ron Santes and Stephen Tallman, mark a massive paradigm shift in the field. They argue that to truly understand competitive advantage, you have to stop staring out the window at the industry and start looking deeply inside the firm itself.
Yes, the emergence of the resource-based view and the focus on internal competences. This is a profound shift from asking what market should we be in to asking what are we uniquely capable of doing better than anyone else.
And to anchor this abstract concept, the text dives into a specific case study that I found absolutely riveting. It is the story of the Japanese beer industry from the 1950s through the early 1990s. We really need to spend some time on this because it perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of traditional external strategy against a competitor who masters internal competences.
It is a textbook example of competitive upheaval. For decades, the market looked incredibly stable, almost stagnant, really.
Let's paint the picture of Kirin. From the post-war era all the way to the mid-1980s, the Japanese beer market was essentially a lockdown monopoly, and Kirin was the undisputed king. They held an astonishing 60% market share, and their strategy was built entirely on what the text calls static asset dominance.
Right. They played the structural game flawlessly. They built physical and logistical barriers to entry that were practically insurmountable.
Detail Kirin's setup because the sheer scale is staggering. They didn't just brew beer. They control the entire ecosystem. They built a monolithic national distribution system. They systematically locked in nearly 100,000 independent distributors and retailers across Japan, essentially mandating that if you wanted to sell beer, you predominantly sold Kirin.
And to supply that locked-in network, they pursued economies of scale with a singular, relentless focus. Their strategy was simple. Every 2 years, build a larger, more automated, more efficient mega brewery.
It was bigger and bigger.
Exactly. By achieving massive volume, they drove their per-unit production costs down to a level no competitor could touch. They were the absolute low-cost producer, protected by an impenetrable distribution wall. If you analyze the industry using Porter's traditional external frameworks, Kirin was invincible.
But then, bubbling up from the bottom, comes Asahi. In the mid-1980s, Asahi was an afterthought. They had a measly 9% or 10% market share. They were dying. They didn't have the capital to build bigger mega breweries than Kirin. They couldn't break Kirin's stranglehold on the distributors. So they realized they couldn't win playing Kirin's game of static assets. They had to change the rules of engagement by developing radically different internal competences.
And what they developed was a profound mastery of dynamic capabilities.
Explain the difference. What makes a capability dynamic rather than static?
Well, a static asset is a thing you own, a mega brewery, a signed distribution contract, a patent. They are powerful, but they are vulnerable to obsolescence. Dynamic capabilities are about process and organizational agility.
Yeah.
It is the embedded ability of an organization to sense changes in the market, to rapidly integrate new knowledge, and to seamlessly reconfigure its resources to meet that new reality faster than anyone else.
So how did Asahi apply this to beer?
They started by realizing that the Japanese consumer's palate was shifting away from the heavy, bitter lagers Kirin produced toward lighter, crisper tastes. Asahi didn't just tweak a recipe, they revamped their entire organizational structure to become a rapid response innovation machine. They developed incredibly tight feedback loops between their market researchers, their master brewers, and their marketing teams. And they introduced a product called Super Dry. It was a radical departure in taste, packaging, and marketing.
And it was an absolute phenomenon. The market went crazy for it. But here is the critical part. Why didn't Kirin just immediately copy the recipe and crush Asahi with their massive factories?
Because Kirin's entire organization, their static assets, was rigidly optimized for producing massive volumes of a single specific type of beer, their supply chains, their brewing vats, their marketing departments, their internal culture.
Right.
It was an oil tanker that took miles to turn. When Asahi launched Super Dry, they had the dynamic capabilities to rapidly scale production and adapt their marketing on the fly. Kirin was paralyzed by its own rigid efficiency. By the time Kirin managed to retool its factories and launch a competing dry beer, Asahi had already captured the public's imagination, shattered Kirin's distribution monopoly by creating overwhelming consumer pull, and fundamentally dislodged the king.
It proves that you can buy a massive factory, but you cannot easily buy a culture of rapid cross-functional innovation. It has to be built internally over years. Which brings us directly to Cliff Bowman's chapter 14 on formulating strategy. Bowman introduces a framework that I think every single listener needs to apply to their own career or business immediately. He draws a hard, unforgiving line between what he calls entry assets and strategic assets.
It is perhaps the most clarifying distinction in the entire section on internal competences.
Let me try to break this down, and you tell me if I have the mechanism right, because I think management teams constantly confuse the two, and it leads to massive misallocation of capital. Bowman defines entry assets as the bare minimum table stakes. It's the cost of admission to even be allowed to play the game in your industry.
Yeah.
So if I am running a modern commercial bank, having a highly secure, encrypted online banking platform and being fully compliant with federal financial regulations, those are entry assets.
Correct.
But executives often look at the millions of dollars they spend on cybersecurity and think, look at this massive strategic advantage we are building. But it's not an advantage at all, is it? Because it doesn't win a single new customer. Nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to open a checking account with Bank A because they meet baseline federal encryption standards. They expect that by default.
Exactly. If you don't have a secure app, you are out of business instantly. But having it provides zero competitive differentiation. Every other surviving bank has it too. It is merely the ticket to enter the stadium.
Right. Whereas strategic assets are the unique, highly protected, hard-to-copy resources or capabilities that actually cause a customer to choose you over a rival or allow you to deliver the service at a fundamentally lower cost. It's the proprietary algorithm that accurately predicts credit risk better than anyone else. It's an exceptionally loyal, cult-like brand community. It's a patented manufacturing process that cuts waste in half.
And Bowman's warning is that companies frequently fall into the trap of pouring all their energy, time, and capital into polishing their entry assets. They obsess over upgrading their HR software or making their supply chain 1% more standard, congratulating themselves on improving the company.
While the important stuff rots.
Yes. Meanwhile, their actual strategic assets, the unique creative spark, the specialized R&D, are slowly starving from lack of attention. To formulate a winning strategy, you have to clearly identify the very few assets that actually drive perceived value for the end consumer and relentlessly, disproportionately invest your resources there.
Okay, so let's zoom out. Imagine a firm that has internalized all of this. They understand their boundaries to avoid transaction costs. They have survived the evolutionary shifts of the market. They have built an internal culture of dynamic capabilities. They clearly separate their strategic assets from their entry assets, and as a result, they are completely dominating their strategic group in their home market. They are untouchable, and they are generating massive amounts of cash.
Which is the exact moment the executive board usually gets bored, gets greedy, and decides to complicate everything.
Inevitably, they sit in the boardroom, look at their massive cash reserves, and say, we are the best in the world at manufacturing athletic shoes. You know what we should do? We should buy a software analytics company and a chain of healthy juice bars, and we should expand our operations into 60 new countries. And boom, we transitioned into parts 3 and the forvi of the text. Corporate strategy and international strategy.
This is a fundamental shift in the level of analysis. We are no longer talking about how a single business unit fights a single competitor in a single market. We are now talking about the role of the corporate center, the holding company, the headquarters, managing a vast portfolio of completely different businesses across different geographies.
Part 3 opens with what I think is the central dilemma of modern capitalism. Why do companies diversify? Michael Gould and Kathleen Lux tackle this in Chapter 17, tracing the rather chaotic evolution of management thinking on diversification over the last 40 years. Because for a long time, the stock market absolutely loved a sprawling conglomerate.
They did. Look at the 1960s and 70s. You had companies like ITT or Gulf plus Western that were essentially massive mutual funds disguised as corporations. They owned hotels, rental car companies, insurance firms, and manufacturing plants, all under one corporate umbrella.
The logic was that a brilliant team of executives at the corporate center could allocate capital between these wildly different businesses more efficiently than the open stock market could. If the rental car business generated cash, the corporate center could instantly funnel it to the high-growth tech division without having to deal with banks or Wall Street.
But that pure conglomerate model eventually collapsed under its own weight and inefficiency. The stock market began applying a conglomerate discount, realizing that these sprawling empires were impossible to manage effectively.
So executives had to come up with new justifications for why they were spending billions of shareholder dollars to buy other companies. The text outlines the defenses that emerged. They started arguing that they weren't just buying random companies anymore. They were exploiting core competencies across different sectors. Or they argued that a new acquisition perfectly fit the dominant logic of the top management team. But the most famous and most dangerous justification they used was synergy.
Synergy. It is perhaps the most seductive and destructive word in the corporate dictionary.
I want to push back on this a little bit because I understand the text is brutally skeptical of synergy, but surely it exists, right? When Disney bought Marvel or when they bought Star Wars, that wasn't just empire building. That was pure textbook synergy. They take an intellectual property, put it through their world-class theme parks, their cruise lines, their merchandising engine, their streaming service. 1 + 1 undeniably equaled 3 in that scenario. You can't tell me the corporate center added no value there.
Disney is the classic, heavily cited exception that proves the rule. They have a highly unique set of strategic assets, specifically designed to monetize IP across multiple channels. But the text is warning against the other 95% of mergers that claim synergy.
Right.
The authors argue that synergy is very often just a post hoc rationalization. It's an excuse invented by investment bankers and ambitious CEOs to justify an acquisition they wanted to do anyway, driven by ego, the desire to manage a larger empire, or simply the pressure to show top-line revenue growth to Wall Street.
There is a quote in the text about the anticipated benefits of synergy that I absolutely love. It says that these supposed synergistic benefits show, quote, an almost unshakable resolve not to appear when it becomes time for their release.
It is a very dry, academic way of saying that synergy is mostly a myth used to sell bad deals. The text cites extensive empirical evidence showing that in the vast majority of mergers, the actual financial gains, if there are any, do not come from brilliant cross-selling or shared R&D or magical cultural integration.
Where do they come from then?
They come from brutal, painful restructuring. They come from asset disposals, firing redundant staff in HR and accounting, and squeezing suppliers. It's not the glorious 1 + 1 = 3 that was promised in the press release. It's often 1 + 1 = 1.5, and the corporate center is quietly selling off the remaining 0.5 for scrap to cover the massive debt they took on to buy the company.
But mechanically, why is it so hard to achieve? Let's say two companies merge with the best of intentions. Why does the corporate center struggle so much to actually extract that value?
Because of the profound problem of asymmetric information and resource allocation. Imagine you are the CEO at the corporate center of a diversified firm. You are sitting in an office in New York. On Tuesday morning, the head of your high-growth, cash-burning software division comes in and demands $1 billion for R&D to capture a new market.
Okay.
On Tuesday afternoon, the head of your slow-growth, highly profitable manufacturing division comes in and asks for $1 billion to upgrade a factory in Ohio. How do you decide?
Yeah. How do you?
You don't know. You do not have the deep, granular, daily knowledge of the software market, nor do you fully understand the operational intricacies of the Ohio factory. The division heads know drastically more than you do, and they are both heavily incentivized to exaggerate their potential returns to get the budget.
So the CEO is just sitting there staring at competing spreadsheets, essentially guessing?
Exactly. And furthermore, the text highlights the danger of the dominant logic. The top executives at the corporate center develop their mental models, their dominant logic, by succeeding in their original core business. If the core business is low-cost, high-volume commodity manufacturing, the executives learn to value strict cost control, standardization, and slow, predictable growth.
Right. So if they buy something different.
If they then acquire a creative, volatile, high-margin software startup, they will inevitably apply their manufacturing dominant logic to the software company. They will demand standard hours, cut the R&D budget to improve quarterly margins, and install rigid reporting structures.
And then everyone leaves.
Exactly. Within a year, all the creative talent will quit, and the corporate center will have successfully destroyed the exact value they paid a premium to acquire. The text forces executives to deeply question, does the corporate parent actually add value to a business, or does it just add a layer of suffocating bureaucracy?
It really makes you read the financial news differently. Every time a CEO announces a transformational synergistic merger, you have to assume there's a good chance they're about to light $1 billion on fire.
Usually, yeah.
But, okay, let's step away from buying totally different businesses. Let's say a company decides to stick to what it knows, but it wants to take its core product global. It wants to evolve from a domestic champion into a multinational enterprise, an MNE. How do they rationalize expanding across borders, given all the complexities of different languages, laws, and cultures?
This brings us squarely into international strategy. And the foundational framework the text leans on here is John Dunning's OLI eclectic paradigm. It is considered the gold standard for explaining the sequence of why a company chooses foreign direct investment, meaning actually building a factory or an office in another country, rather than just exporting their product from home or licensing their technology to a local foreign firm.
OLI. It stands for Ownership, Location, and Internalization. Let's break this down mechanically because it builds on everything we've discussed so far. Let's use a hypothetical example. Let's say I run a company in Germany that makes incredibly advanced, high-precision robotic arms for automotive manufacturing.
Perfect. So the first hurdle in the OLI paradigm is ownership advantages. Dunning argues that doing business in a foreign country is inherently more difficult than doing business at home. You don't know the local laws, the culture, the labor unions, or the political landscape. The local domestic firms have a massive home field advantage.
Right.
Therefore, to go abroad and actually beat local companies on their own turf, you must possess a significant ownership advantage. This ties directly back to our discussion of strategic assets. It must be something proprietary that the local firms simply cannot replicate.
So in my case, it's the incredibly complex, patented software that drives the robotic arm, and perhaps a reputation for zero-defect German engineering that took 50 years to build. If I just made generic, low-quality robots, I'd have no ownership advantage, and the local foreign firms would crush me on price. I should just stay home.
Exactly. Ownership is the prerequisite.
Yeah.
The second step is location advantages. This explains where you choose to go. If you have the superior robotic arm, why do you build a massive new factory in Vietnam instead of just expanding your factory in Munich and shipping the robots on boats?
Because of location-specific factors that I can only access by being physically present there.
Right. It could be drastically cheaper labor costs. It could be proximity to a massive new cluster of automotive factories being built in Southeast Asia, so you save on shipping and can offer faster repair services. Or, crucially, it could be to bypass massive import tariffs that a foreign government has slapped on German robots. The location advantage dictates the geography.
Which brings us to the final and most complex piece, internalization. And I see how this connects directly back to Coase and the first section of our deep dive.
It absolutely does. The question of internalization is this. You have the patented robot, which is ownership. You know you want it built in Vietnam to access cheap labor and avoid tariffs, which is location. Why do you spend $100 million to build and manage your own factory in Vietnam? Why not just find a local Vietnamese manufacturing company, hand them your blueprints, license them the technology, let them deal with the local labor laws, and just collect a royalty check?
Because the transaction costs and the risks of using the open market are too high.
Exactly. If you license your most advanced proprietary technology to a third-party factory in a country with weak intellectual property laws, the risk is enormous. They might build your robots during the day shift and then run a ghost shift at night, stealing your blueprints, copying your software, and pumping out cheaper knockoffs under their own brand. Furthermore, ensuring absolute quality control for a high-precision robot across a language barrier with an independent contractor requires constant, expensive monitoring.
So the friction is too high. You internalize the operation. You build the factory yourself, you hire your own managers, and you keep the proprietary technology entirely within the boundaries of your own firm.
You accept the massive cost of foreign direct investment because the transaction costs of licensing are simply too dangerous to your core strategic assets. That is the OLI paradigm in action.
It is so satisfying to see how these theories stack on top of each other. Coase's transaction costs from 1937 directly explain how a modern robotics firm structures its global supply chain today. But international strategy hasn't stopped evolving. Chapter 23 by Alan Rugman and Elaine Verbeek offers a really powerful modern critique of the older models, specifically taking aim at some of Michael Porter's foundational ideas about global competition.
Yes, Porter's diamond of national competitiveness model. For a long time, this was the prevailing view. Porter essentially argued that a multinational corporation's competitive advantage is overwhelmingly driven by the characteristics of its single, original home base.
So sticking with my robotics example, my firm is globally dominant because I was forged in the fires of the German industrial landscape.
Yeah.
I had access to brilliant German engineering universities, I had to survive the intense rivalry of other German manufacturing firms, and I had demanding, high-quality local suppliers. Germany created my strength, and I'm simply exporting that German strength to the rest of the world.
That is the single home base view. Headquarters is the brain, and the foreign subsidiaries are just tentacles executing the brain's orders. But Rugman and Burgick argue that in the modern globalized economy, this view is dangerously outdated. They argue that successful modern multinationals operate on a triad regional basis and have evolved to have multiple home bases.
Meaning the brain isn't just in one place anymore.
Precisely. A massive, modern MNE might have its corporate and financial headquarters in New York to access capital markets. It might have its high-tech software R&D home base in Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv to access the best coding talent. And it might have its advanced manufacturing home base in Shenzhen, China, to access the deepest electronic supply chain in the world. They aren't just staging globalization from one country. They are managing a highly integrated transnational network of excellence.
And the text highlights a specific, excruciating strategic challenge this creates for executives trying to manage this network. They have to constantly balance what the authors call location-bound and non-location-bound firm-specific advantages, or FSAs.
This is the daily nightmare of the global CEO. A non-location-bound FSA is a strategic advantage that is highly mobile. The ultimate example is a globally recognized brand name, like Coca-Cola or Apple, or a piece of proprietary software code. You can easily transfer that advantage anywhere in your global network instantly. The Apple logo holds power in Paris in exactly the same way it holds power in Tokyo. It scales effortlessly.
But a location-bound FSA is stubbornly stuck exactly where it was created.
Right. A location-bound advantage might be a deeply integrated 20-year relationship with a specific local government official in Brazil that allows you to navigate the regulatory bureaucracy faster than rivals. Or it might be a highly customized, decentralized distribution network perfectly tailored to reach tiny rural villages in India. Or it could simply be a management culture that is perfectly adapted to navigating the strict labor laws and union structures of Scandinavia.
You can't export that.
You cannot easily package up that Brazilian political relationship or that Scandinavian management culture and export it to a factory in Ohio. It will fail.
So the challenge for the corporate center isn't just barking orders. It is figuring out how to build a global network that is efficient enough to leverage the non-location-bound assets everywhere, while simultaneously remaining flexible and decentralized enough to allow the local subsidiaries to develop and exploit their vital location-bound assets.
It is a multidimensional chess game played across multiple time zones, cultures, and regulatory regimes. And the reality is, even the most brilliant executives eventually make a wrong move, or the chessboard simply gets flipped over by an unpredictable macroeconomic shock or a completely unforeseen technological disruption.
No strategy, no matter how brilliantly formulated, globally integrated, or seemingly invincible, lasts forever. Markets inevitably shift, consumer tastes change, hubris sets in, and companies stumble. And sometimes they don't just stumble, they go into a terrifying, accelerating death spiral. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most vital act of our deep dive, parts V and 6 of the text, dealing with navigating change, turnarounds, and flexibility.
This is where strategic theory meets cold, hard existential crisis.
Chapter 26, authored by Peter McKiernan, deals exclusively with corporate turnarounds. And what struck me immediately when reading this is the language McKiernan uses. He doesn't describe a turnaround as just a standard business restructuring or a financial reengineering. He treats it, almost verbatim, like a severe medical intervention on a dying patient in an emergency room.
The diagnostic metaphor is explicit and intentional. When a company is failing, the panic is palpable. McKiernan breaks the timeline of a corporate turnaround down into 6 distinct sequential stages: causes, triggers, diagnosis, retrenchment, recovery, and renewal.
We need to walk through the mechanics of these stages because anyone who has lived through massive corporate layoffs or company collapsing will recognize the grim anatomy of this process.
It always begins with the causes. This is the long-term, often hidden rot we discussed at the very beginning with the termite metaphor. The causes are rarely a single sudden event. It is usually strategic drift, the company slowly, imperceptibly losing touch with what its customers actually want.
It's gradual.
It's a bloated cost structure that grew during the good years. It's an arrogant culture that dismissed a scrappy new competitor as a toy. The company is fundamentally sick. The termites are eating the beams, but the outward financial symptoms might not be acute yet. They might still be paying dividends.
Until the trigger event happens.
Right. The trigger is the sudden, undeniable heart attack. It's the catastrophic quarterly earnings miss that tanks the stock by 40% in a day. It's the sudden bankruptcy of their largest client. It's the bank violently calling in a massive loan. The trigger shatters the illusion. It forces the dominant coalition, the entrenched top management team, or the sleepy board of directors to finally acknowledge that the company is in a terminal crisis.
And then the patient is wheeled into the ER and we enter the diagnosis phase. And the text makes what I consider to be the most critical point in this entire section regarding how companies handled this phase.
Because the natural human instinct in a panic is to just grab the nearest, most aggressive generic medicine available and administer it immediately. The board panics, they fire the CEO, bring in a notorious turnaround specialist, and instantly mandate a 20% across the board cut in staff and budgets.
But McKiernan heavily emphasizes that because corporate cultures, historical capabilities, and competitive environments are fundamentally unique, every single turnaround must be a meticulously customized solution. There is no generic off-the-shelf prescription for survival.
You have to accurately diagnose the specific nature of the sickness. And the distinction he makes is whether the crisis is primarily operational or strategic.
This is the difference between life and death. An operational crisis means your core strategy is actually fine, the market still wants your product, but you have simply become incredibly fat, inefficient, and slow. Your costs are too high. In that scenario, aggressive operational retrenchment, firing middle management, closing inefficient plants, squeezing suppliers is the correct medicine.
But what if the crisis is strategic? What if the market fundamentally no longer wants your product because the technology has moved on? Say you are a blockbuster video in the age of Netflix streaming.
If you are facing a strategic crisis and you apply operational medicine, if Blockbuster just focuses on cutting the hours of store clerks and negotiating cheaper rent for their retail stores, you are not curing the patient. You are simply managing the decline. You are dying more efficiently. A strategic crisis requires a fundamental reinvention of the core business model, not just cost-cutting.
Which perfectly explains the next phase. Retrenchment versus recovery. Retrenchment is just stopping the bleeding. It's selling off the corporate jets, halting all new hiring, and generating enough emergency cash to make payroll next week. But as the text notes, stopping the bleeding doesn't cure the underlying disease. Retrenchment just keeps the patient alive on the operating table. The recovery phase requires finding a way to actually compete and win in the market again with a viable strategy. And finally, renewal requires changing the deeply ingrained corporate culture to ensure the company doesn't slowly drift back into the exact same arrogant habits that caused the crisis in the first place.
That six-stage process maps a sudden heart attack-style crisis. But what if the end isn't a sudden shock? What if a company is suffering a slow, agonizing, multi-decade fade into irrelevance? This is exactly what Peter Williamson tackles in Chapter 28, introducing the concept of strategy decay.
It is a phenomenal concept because it forces executives to realize that strategies are essentially perishable goods. They have a definitive shelf life.
Right. The absolute peak of a strategy's power is the moment it is successfully implemented. From that day forward, it begins to slowly decay, because competitors inevitably study it and start copying it. The macroeconomic environment shifts. Consumer tastes evolve. The strategy slowly loses its potency.
And the danger is that executives often mistake current financial success for strategic health. Williamson provides 4 highly specific, measurable indicators that your core business model is decaying, even if you are currently still generating cash. These are the vital signs of terminal decline.
If you are an investor or an executive, you need to monitor these 4 indicators constantly. Number 1, a divergence between revenue growth and earnings growth, meaning the top line, your revenues, might still be inching upward because your sales team is desperately discounting products, spending massive amounts on marketing, and shoving inventory into channels. But your actual bottom line earnings are flat or actively falling because the profit margins are collapsing under the effort. It takes more and more fuel just to keep the engine turning at the same speed.
Number 2 is perhaps the most counterintuitive but brilliant indicator, a rising return on capital employed, or ROCE, combined with a falling price-to-earnings, or PE, multiple.
I want to break this down because it sounds like finance jargon, but the mechanism behind it is fascinating. Why does that specific divergence signal doom?
Because you are looking at 2 different time horizons. ROC, return on capital employed, is a backward-looking metric. It essentially measures how efficiently management is squeezing profits out of the factories, patents, and assets they built in the past. It is very easy for a CEO to artificially boost ROCE by simply refusing to invest in any new R&D or new equipment and just relentlessly milking the existing assets.
So they look like geniuses on the quarterly spreadsheet.
But the stock market is a forward-looking voting machine. The PE multiple is a reflection of how much the market believes your future earnings will grow. If your PE multiple is steadily falling while your ROCE is rising, the market is sending a brutal message. The market is saying, we see that you are efficiently milking the old cash cow today, but we don't believe your company has any valuable future left.
The market sees the decay before the accounting department does. Number 3, a high ratio of rents to new value creation. We need a clearly defined economic rents here because it's a specific term.
In economics, a rent isn't what you pay for an apartment. An economic rent is the extra profit you extract simply because you hold a monopoly position, own an exclusive resource, or possess a legacy patent without having to expend any new effort or take any new risks.
Like a landlord who inherits a building in a prime location.
Mhm.
They just sit back and collect the checks as the neighborhood gets more popular. They aren't designing new buildings or improving the property. They're just extracting rents based on past ownership.
Exactly. Williamson argues that when a company stops inventing new products, stops genuinely thrilling its customers with new value, and instead relies entirely on jacking up the prices on its 20-year-old patented drugs, or squeezing higher fees out of its locked-in legacy software customers, that company is living off rents. It is a massive red flag for strategy decay, because the moment a competitor finds a way around that patent or breaks that lock-in, the company has zero new value to fall back on.
And the final indicator, the convergence of strategies across the entire industry.
This is the end point of decay. It's commoditization. It's when you look at an industry, say, retail banking or mid-tier automotive sedans, and every single competitor is doing the exact same thing, targeting the exact same demographics with the exact same features, competing purely on tiny fractional differences in price. The original, unique strategic assets have all been copied, and the industry has decayed into a stagnant war of attrition.
So if you are sitting in the boardroom, you look at your dashboard and you see these four horsemen of the strategic apocalypse: collapsing margins, falling PE, living off rents, and commoditization. What is the solution? How do you arrest the decay?
The text argues that operational cost cutting will not save you from decay. The only cure is strategy innovation. You have to fundamentally build a new growth engine. But here is the crucial nuance that executives often get horribly wrong. You cannot simply sit in a room, brainstorm one magical new paradigm-shifting idea, and bet the entire future of the multi-billion-dollar company on it.
Because the future is inherently too chaotic and unpredictable. You can't just pivot the entire Titanic toward one specific island you think you see in the fog.
Exactly. The failure rate of new corporate ventures is staggering. Williamson argues that to survive decay, a company must systematically develop a broad portfolio of what he calls options on the future. They need a robust, constant pipeline of small, low-cost experiments, pilot programs, minority investments in startups, and internal skunkworks projects running concurrently.
You need lots of bets.
You go into this knowing that 80% of these experiments will completely fail, but the 20% that show promise are cultivated, funded further, and allowed to mature. By the time the core business model completely rots away, one of those mature experiments is ready to be scaled up and take over as the new core strategy.
Which brings us perfectly to the very end of our journey through this massive text. We transition into part 6, focusing on flexibility, and specifically the concept of real options, deeply explored by Bruce Kogut and Nolan Kulatalaka.
This is a brilliant synthesis because it takes the abstract idea of exploring the future and grounds it in rigorous mathematical financial theory.
To understand real options in corporate strategy, we first have to understand what an option is in the financial markets. In finance, buying a call option gives you the right, but absolutely not the obligation, to buy a stock at a specific price at a specific date in the future. You pay a small, non-refundable premium today. If the stock explodes in value, you exercise your right, buy the stock at the cheap agreed-upon price, and make a fortune. But if the stock completely crashes, you simply walk away. You don't have to buy it. Your total loss is strictly capped at that small initial premium you paid. You bought the flexibility to make a decision later when you have more information about how the chaotic market actually played out.
And Kogut and Kulatalaka argue that modern corporate managers must apply this exact same option pricing logic to their physical strategic investments, hence the term real options.
Why is this so revolutionary compared to how companies normally make investment decisions?
Because traditional strategic planning is dominated by a financial tool called net present value, or NPV. When a CEO wants to build a new factory, the finance department builds a spreadsheet. They try to predict the cash flows for the next 10 years. They discount those future cash flows back to today's value, and if the number is positive, they build the factory. But NPV has a fatal flaw. It demands certainty, and it absolutely hates volatility. In a highly uncertain, chaotic new market, the NPV spreadsheet almost always returns a negative number. It essentially tells management, this new technology is too risky, do nothing, stick to the old business model.
which mathematically guarantees that the company will suffer strategy decay and eventually die.
Exactly. NPV optimizes for the present but destroys the future. Real options theory completely changes the mathematics of strategic investment. It forces managers to assign a tangible financial value to flexibility.
Let's run a scenario to show how this changes the CEO's decision. Let's say it's 2010, and a major automaker is looking at electric vehicles. The market is tiny, the battery tech is unproven, and consumer demand is a massive question mark.
If the CEO runs a traditional NPV analysis on building a massive billion-dollar EV gigafactory, the spreadsheet will scream, "No! It looks like a guaranteed money loser." But if the CEO uses real options thinking, they don't bet $1 billion. Instead, they invest $20 million to build a small experimental battery R&D lab and maybe launch a limited-run hybrid car. On a traditional spreadsheet, that $20 million is a sunk cost with no immediate return. But through the lens of real options, that $20 million is the premium they are paying to buy a strategic option.
They are buying the right to play in the EV market.
Yes. They are buying organizational learning. They're developing the initial dynamic capabilities. Fast forward 5 years. If the EV market turns out to be a total bust, they simply walk away. They don't exercise the option to scale up. Their losses are strictly capped at the $20 million premium, which for a major automaker is negligible. But if the EV market suddenly explodes, if battery costs plummet and consumer demand skyrockets, they're already in the game. They exercise their option. They use the knowledge and capabilities they developed in the lab to rapidly scale up to a gigafactory, leaving competitors who waited for absolute certainty completely in the dust.
Real options provide the rigorous mathematical justification for exploring the unknown, rather than just endlessly blindly exploiting current assets until they turn to dust. It gives executives a framework to safely experiment with the future, even in the face of massive, paralyzing uncertainty. So what does this all mean? We have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of intellectual terrain today. We took this massive, dense Oxford Handbook and pulled out the absolute core narrative of how a modern corporation survives.
And it is a deeply compelling, surprisingly cohesive narrative when you step back and look at the whole picture.
We started with the realization that the sterile, perfect models of classical economics could not map the messy, irrational, deeply human reality of actual business competition. We saw how firms construct boundaries around themselves, specifically to avoid the grinding friction and transaction costs of the open market, only to realize that they still remain at the mercy of harsh, Darwinian evolutionary shifts in the broader environment.
We explored the sheer brutal difficulty of profiting from a brilliant innovation. We learned why you need to build that legal appropriation regime, fight to establish the dominant design, and, most importantly, secure massive complementary assets so that a larger rival doesn't just steal the fruits of your genius.
We looked deeply inside the firm, discarding the old view of just analyzing the external industry. We learned from the Japanese beer wars how to build dynamic organizational capabilities that are virtually immune to imitation. We learned how to relentlessly separate the mere entry assets, the table stakes, from the true strategic assets that actually allow you to win the game.
We completely debunked the easy, seductive myth of corporate synergies, revealing how corporate centers often destroy value through asymmetric information. We mapped the incredible complexity of modern multinational networks, moving past the idea of a single home base to understand how firms must balance global scale with hyper-local, location-bound advantages across the world.
And finally, we look at the end game. We explored how every brilliant strategy inevitably decays into commoditization. We learned how to medically diagnose a corporate crisis before the fatal trigger event, distinguishing between operational inefficiency and strategic rot. And we learned how to use the mathematics of real options to justify continuously experimenting with the future.
If there is one core lesson, one single overarching takeaway from all these hundreds of pages of academic research and decades of corporate history, it is this. Strategy is not a static document. It is not a rational optimization puzzle that you solve once, print out, and put on a shelf. Strategy is a living, breathing, ongoing, dynamic process. It is the continuous, exhausting, never-ending act of matching unique, hard-to-copy internal resources with highly uncertain, constantly shifting external environments.
It never stops. The moment you think you have won, you have already begun to lose. Which leaves me with a final thought, a question for you to mull over as you look at your own company, the trajectory of your own career, or the global market at large. We started this journey by talking about the illusion of the termite-infested house, the terrifying reality that outward financial success often masks internal strategic rot. If strategy really is this endless, exhausting cycle, if it requires painstakingly building a competitive advantage, watching it inevitably decay into commoditization, and then needing to urgently, desperately innovate all over again, it begs a really provocative question about the nature of corporate leadership. Are the most successful, enduring companies in the world the ones who are best at flawlessly executing their current, brilliant business plan? Or are the true long-term winners the ones who are most willing to systematically, ruthlessly, and intentionally destroy their own successful business models before the market does it for them?